Nature is a realm of chaos. It is a world of jagged edges, uneven growth, and violent erosion. Nature abhors a perfect line. It abhors a perfect circle. If you look at a mountain, a riverbed, or a forest, you will see a million shapes born from random chance. When we find absolute, flawless geometry buried deep in the earth, we know it was not placed there by the wind or the rain. We know it was placed there by a mind. But what happens when that mind belongs to a time that is not supposed to exist? In the deep, suffocating jungles of Central America, the earth has been hiding a mathematical impossibility. A shape so flawless, so heavily burdened by the weight of time, that it breaks the accepted timeline of human engineering. They are buried in the mud. They are hidden under the roots of ancient mahogany trees. Perfect, massive spheres of solid rock. Too heavy to move, too precise to be carved by primitive hands. And yet there they sit, a silent geometry waiting in the dark. To understand the scale of this anomaly, we must travel back to the 1930s. The world was caught in the grip of the Great Depression. While the cities of the North were starving, powerful corporations were looking south, seeking new lands to exploit. The United Fruit Company was one of the most powerful empires on Earth. They did not just trade goods, they owned nations. They bought governments. And in the 1930s, they set their sights on the Diques Delta of Costa Rica. The Diques Delta was an impenetrable wall of green. It was a suffocating, malarial jungle, untouched by the modern world. The United Fruit Company wanted it cleared. They needed millions of acres of flat, fertile land to plant bananas. They sent in armies of men with machetes, axes, and heavy, smoke-belching bulldozers to tear the ancient forest down to the mud. It was grueling, terrifying work. The men fought through swarms of insects, poisonous snakes, and suffocating humidity. But in the midst of this chaotic destruction, something stopped the blades of the bulldozers. The workers reported hitting massive boulders hidden in the dense undergrowth. But when they cleared the vines and the mud away, they realized these were not ordinary rocks. They were spheres. At first, the foreman thought it was a strange geological fluke, a rock worn down by a prehistoric river. But as the clearing continued, they found another, and another. Soon, dozens of these massive stone balls were dragged from the shadows. They ranged in size from a few inches across, no bigger than a heavy cannonball, to monstrous globes over 2 meters in diameter. The largest of them weighed an astonishing 15 tons, but it was not their size that silenced the workers. It was their shape. They were perfect. If you take a tape measure around the circumference of these massive stones, the measurements are almost entirely uniform. They are not slightly oval. They are not lopsided. They are perfect mathematical spheres. Crafted with a precision that defies the tools of the era they supposedly belong to. The official historical explanation, the one that eventually made its way into the textbooks, is simple, almost dismissive. The academic consensus states that indigenous tribes carved these spheres sometime between the year 300 and the year 1500. The official narrative claims that these primitive people used smaller, harder rocks to slowly chip away at massive boulders, pecking at the stone for generations until it became round. Then they supposedly rubbed the stone with sand and water to polish it to a smooth finish. It is a comfortable explanation. It keeps the timeline intact. But when you look closely at the physical reality of the stones, the official story begins to fracture. Let us consider the material. The vast majority of these spheres are carved from a rock called granodiorite. Granodiorite is an igneous rock born from the slow cooling of magma deep beneath the Earth's surface. It is incredibly hard, it is dense, it is unforgiving. If you were to take a piece of granodiorite today and attempt to shape it into a perfect sphere, you would need industrial machinery. You would need diamond-tipped saws, motorized lathes, and computer-guided measuring tools. Even with modern technology, creating a perfect 15-ton sphere from solid granodiorite is a monumental engineering challenge. Are we truly meant to believe that men in loincloths, suffering in the sweltering heat of the jungle, achieved millimeter-perfect sphericity by simply banging rocks together? Consider the mathematics required. To create a sphere, you cannot simply chip away at the edges. You must maintain a constant, perfect radius from an invisible center point buried deep inside the rock. If you make a mistake, if you chip too deeply on one side, the entire geometry is ruined. You cannot glue a piece of granodiorite back on. You have to start over. The level of spatial awareness, the geometric planning, and the physical execution required to do this by hand borders on the impossible. And then there is the problem of geography. The United Fruit Company found these spheres sitting in the deep alluvial mud of the Dequis Delta. But granodiorite does not exist in the Dequis Delta. The soil there is soft and marshy. The nearest natural source of this specific type of volcanic rock is located high in the Talamanca Mountains, over 50 miles away. Imagine for a moment the logistics of the official explanation. A tribe of primitive people hikes 50 miles into the jagged, unforgiving mountains. They locate a 15-ton boulder. They somehow quarry it from the mountainside without the use of steel tools or explosives. They then carve it into a perfect sphere, and then they have to move it. How do you move a 15-ton perfect sphere of polished stone across 50 miles of hostile terrain? You cannot simply roll it. The terrain is composed of steep ravines, dense jungle, and deep, fast-flowing rivers. The stone is so heavy it would sink into the mud. It would crush any wooden sled. If you lose control of it on a downward slope, it would obliterate everything in its path. These indigenous tribes had no wheels. They had no horses or beasts of burden. They had only the muscle of men and the fibers of the jungle. Yet hundreds of these massive stones were transported across mountains and swamps, arriving at the delta without a single scratch, chip, or imperfection on their polished surfaces. The historical record is entirely silent on how this was achieved. When the Spanish conquistadors marched through Central America in the 16th century, they documented everything. They wrote detailed accounts of the indigenous people, their customs, their gold, and their architecture. But they made no mention of the spheres. When modern explorers asked the local indigenous populations in the 1930s about the stones, the locals had no answers. They did not know who made them. They did not know how they were moved. The stones were simply there. They were a part of the landscape, as ancient and inexplicable as the mountains themselves. If the people living there in the 1500s did not make them and had no memory of them being made, how old are these stones? As the United Fruit Company continued its brutal clearing of the land, the mystery of the spheres encountered the darkest force in human history: greed. A rumor began to spread among the sweaty, exhausted workers operating the bulldozers. A rumor that these massive stones were not solid. A rumor that the ancient people had somehow hollowed out the center of the spheres and filled them with gold. It was a fever dream born of the Depression, a desperate hope for instant wealth in a miserable place. But it was enough to seal the fate of these ancient masterpieces. The workers grabbed their drills. They bored deep holes into the perfect, smooth faces of the granodiorite. They stuffed the holes with dynamite, lit the fuses, and ran. The explosions echoed through the jungle canopy. When the smoke cleared, the workers rushed back to inspect the rubble. They found no gold. They found no hidden chambers. They found only jagged, broken chunks of solid, ancient rock. Dozens of the most perfect geometric anomalies on Earth were blown to pieces by men looking for a quick payday. By the time the United Fruit Company executives realized what was happening and ordered the destruction to stop, an incalculable amount of history had already been erased. But the dynamite destroyed something far more important than the stones themselves. It destroyed their context. When the bulldozers pushed the surviving spheres out of the way to plant bananas, they destroyed the original placement of the stones. According to the early reports from the foremen on the ground, the spheres were not scattered randomly. They were arranged. Some were placed in long, perfectly straight lines. Others were arranged in massive triangles. Some reports suggested that the lines of spheres pointed directly toward magnetic north. Others suggested they were aligned with the solstices, or the rising of specific constellations in the night sky. If these stones were a massive terrestrial map of the heavens or a complex navigational grid, we will never know. The United Fruit Company uprooted them. They rolled them into ditches. They shipped some of them off to decorate the manicured lawns of wealthy executives in the capital. The grand design, whatever it was scattered to the winds. It was not until the late 1940s that academia finally took notice. Doris Stone, an archaeologist and the daughter of a United Fruit Company executive, published the first scientific report on the spheres. Her work caught the attention of Samuel Lothrop, a prominent archaeologist from Harvard University. In 1948, Lothrop traveled to the Dequease Delta. He brought with him a team of researchers, tape measures, and surveying equipment. He spent months cataloging the surviving stones, measuring their diameters, and interviewing the locals. Lothrop's findings were deeply unsettling to the academic establishment. He confirmed that the stones were, indeed, incredibly close to perfect spheres. He confirmed that the granodiorite came from miles away, and he confirmed that there was absolutely no evidence of the tools used to create them. No copper chisels, no iron saws, no massive stone hammers capable of shaping a 15-ton boulder. The tools of the makers had vanished as completely as the makers themselves. When Lothrop excavated the areas around the remaining stones, he found layers of buried pottery. Some of the pottery belonged to the known indigenous tribes of the region. But some of it was older, much older. The stratigraphy, the layers of earth and mud that built up over centuries, suggested that some of these stones had been sitting in the exact same spot for thousands of years, long before the known tribes migrated into the delta, long before the official timeline allowed for such massive, coordinated engineering projects. The academic community did what it always does when confronted with something that does not fit the established narrative. They filed it away. They labeled the spheres as ritual objects or symbols of chieftain status. It is the universal academic translation for, "We have absolutely no idea what these are." They placed a few of the smaller spheres in museums, placed placards in front of them with safe estimated dates, and moved on. But the silence of the archives cannot cover the deafening mystery of the stones themselves. Why would a civilization dedicate millions of hours of grueling, backbreaking labor to create perfect geometry in the middle of a dense jungle? If they were symbols of power, why place them miles away from the settlements? If they were religious idols, why are there no faces, no carvings, no hieroglyphs? Every other ancient civilization carved their gods into stone. They carved serpents, jaguars, and human forms. But the makers of the Dequease spheres carved nothing. They left the surface completely blank. They dedicated all their energy, all their knowledge, purely to the mathematics of the shape. A sphere is the most efficient shape in the universe. It has the smallest surface area for the greatest volume. It is the shape of planets. It is the shape of stars. It is the shape of a drop of water suspended in the void. It is a shape that speaks of a profound understanding of physics and geometry. Were these stones functioning as something more than just monuments? Some researchers, operating on the fringes of the accepted archives, have suggested that the sheer density and shape of the granodiorite stones could have properties we no longer understand. Granodiorite contains high levels of quartz. Quartz is a piezoelectric material. It can generate an electrical charge under intense pressure. If you arrange massive quartz-rich spheres in geometric patterns across a landscape, are you building a monument? Or are you building a machine? The records of the 1930s are filled with stories of compasses spinning wildly when placed near certain spheres. The early surveyors for the United Fruit Company noted strange magnetic anomalies in the Dequease Delta, anomalies that made it difficult to chart the land. Were the spheres placed on specific magnetic nodes of the Earth? Were they receiving something? Were they transmitting something? We are looking at the remnants of a society through the narrow, arrogant lens of our own time. Because we build with steel and wire, we assume that any advanced civilization must have also built with steel and wire. When we look at stone, we see only primitive tools. We see only crude labor. But what if stone was not the primitive alternative to our technology? What if stone was the technology itself? A machine made of iron will rust away to nothing in 1,000 years. A record written on paper will burn. A database stored on a server will vanish the moment the power stops flowing. But a 15-ton perfect sphere of polished granodiorite will wait. It will sit in the mud, impervious to the rain, impervious to the jungle, outlasting the rise and fall of 100 empires. It is the ultimate form of data storage. It communicates a single unbreakable message across the abyss of time. We were here. We understood the mathematics of the universe, and we possess the power to mold the earth to our will. Today, the surviving spheres sit on the manicured lawns of government buildings in Costa Rica. They sit in the courtyards of museums. They have been stripped of their original alignment, washed clean of the jungle mud, and turned into decorative lawn ornaments for a world that has forgotten how to listen to them. The United Fruit Company got their bananas. The bulldozers won. The ancient grid was shattered. But out there, deep in the remaining unexplored sections of the Talamanca Mountains, beneath centuries of thick vegetation and shadow, the earth is still heavy. The locals still whisper of hidden valleys where the stones are still in their original formations, where the geometry remains unbroken. We walk across the surface of a world we claim to understand. We draw our timelines, we write our textbooks, and we confidently declare the limits of human history. We assume that the past was simple, dark, and crude. But then, the blade of a bulldozer strikes something hard in the dark. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of accidents, an obsession with shape by an isolated tribe with too much time and extraordinary patience. Maybe the alignments were just coincidences and the magnetic anomalies just a trick of the soil. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize. Maybe they knew that the world was going to end, and they left us the only message that could survive the flood. A perfect silent geometry, waiting for us to remember what it means.